Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening to you all. My name's John Parker, Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association, and I would like to welcome you all to our headquarters here in Stonehouse in the UK for our webinar this evening. Please use the chat to say hello, but please, I can see that lots of you are already doing it. Please make sure that when you type your message, you put all panelists and attendees before you do so. Otherwise, it will just come to us. So all panelists and attendees. If you've got any questions for our guests, then please submit them using the Q&A button only. Otherwise, I will probably lose them and your question won't be asked. Before turning to this evening's action, I just wanted to tell you very briefly about what we have in store for you next week. Now, here at the Arboricultural Association, we like to bring you the very best speakers and projects from all over the world. And next week, you're in for a treat. We're going to be joined by Rachel Sheridan from the US Forest Service International Program, who will be talking about some of the amazing work she's involved with across the globe. And we'll also be hearing from my very dear friend, Paul Mandabondabo from the University of Otto Geisler in Jayapura, Papua, who will be giving a presentation about his project, Green Cities for Papua. The link to register will appear in the chat, and I would encourage you, all of you, to sign up and join us. And finally, I'd just like to remind everyone about our exciting new public-facing website and subscription grade Tree Care Supporter. This has really generated some interest since we launched it last week, and we'd love it if you could visit the website and let us know what you think. You can find everything you need to know at treecare.org.uk. And as there's so many people there, I should also say, if you're not a member of the association, you should consider joining us. I'm sure a link to membership will appear in the chat as well. So, more than enough from me. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker with a presentation which I suspect is going to generate some healthy debate in the chat. Over to you, Jeremy Barrell.
Hi, thanks, John. I think we're on track there. I think it's just fantastic to see. I didn't see the final numbers there, but it looks like it's nearly 500 people. So that puts the pressure on, doesn't it? And I think I did, I was just looking, I did a video as a preparation for this, and it was on 993 views about 10 minutes ago, and I thought, oh, perhaps we should have offered you know, a £10,000 prize for the 1,000th person to view it. So yeah, we're not offering it, but I thought that might be quite a good idea. Anyway, thanks for everybody. I mean, this is a lot of people to show up, so that's great. That's really good. So thanks for turning up. I think today I'm going to be talking about pruning and specifically crown reduction. And there's, for those of you who aren't really aware of what that means, crown reduction is basically reducing the length of branches for various reasons. And what better place to start? I mean, there can be a range of degrees of the work, but what better place to start than one of our best institutions in Britain, Kew Gardens. And this is a plane tree at Kew, and this has got a very, it has been crown reduced. I mean, the test of a good crown reduction is that you can't see it's being done, and that's what we've got here. So this is a very sort of a light crown reduction that doesn't really show too much. And then you can go to increasing degrees of work. I'll just get onto that. Increasing degrees of work all the way through to the most severe. And this is sort of an intermediate way, which is pollarding, which is regular pruning back to pruning points. And you can do this on most types of trees, certainly non-tropical trees, although I know there's a lot of viewers here from the tropics as well. So not sure about that, but certainly in the temperate regions, we do that. And this is a great way. It's a sort of halfway house. It's a great way of keeping trees for a long, long time and making the most of all the benefits that they offer. And then at the furthest extremes, we get to this type of situation, and the tree on the right-hand side has basically been chopped in half, and that really is probably the most severe interpretation of crown reduction, and that's what we'd call topping. And I think in terms of the talk today, I've called it the topping blind spot. And I think I've called it that because the aversion to actually topping has been so strong that it's actually clouded our wider perspective, I think, in many instances. So I want to talk about that today. And it's always good to start with a story. And for those of you who are not in the UK, there was a great TV series called Ripping Yarns, which used to be on a Friday or Saturday night, and used to sit down and watch, and it always had a neat little twist to it. And they were always fun to watch. And I was thinking, well, you know, actually, unfortunately, in our boroculture, there's not most of the stories that we've got are pretty awful, and I want to go through some of those. So the first awful story that we've got is turning from, you know, how you can turn success into disaster in 30 years, and that's something that we'll look at first of all. And then, yeah, you know, the next awful story that I've got is about how Vanity ruined the day. And if you're a tree lover, then that's two awful stories. And unfortunately, you know, it's unfortunately sorry, just hold on a second. Unfortunately, it's not third time lucky for trees; it's third time unlucky. And where the drive for professionalism is causing great harm, I think, to trees. And so I want to talk about that. So first, to kick it all off, there's three short stories. And then I want to look at crown reduction in a bit more detail and just pull out three or four myths and facts that I think are relevant to what we should be thinking about today. And then finally, it's all doom and gloom up to this point, I'm sure, but I want to go through some case studies. And I think, you know, we're late in the day now for us here, certainly in the US and other countries, it's a bit earlier. And I want to make it sort of image heavy, I think, so you can sit back and just watch and see some case studies and see how it goes. So that's what we're going to go through today. Now, just to try and get some audience engagement, we're going to run a poll and for you, and you can participate here. And the wording's up on there, and Sophie's just put the sort of poll recording mechanism on there on the screen for you. And the question is, do you think that crown reduction in all its forms, so that includes all the three forms that we've seen from minimal to severe, should be a mainstream tree pruning technique? And we need to keep it quite simple, and it doesn't matter, you're anonymous anyway, so nobody's going to know what you said. But yes, you think that crown reduction can be useful, or no, it can be seen as unprofessional and it should be avoided. So those are the questions, or that's the question. The answers are there. If you pop it on, as soon as Sophie thinks we've got enough, she's going to give us the answers. So we've got yes, and I'm just going to make a note of that, 78%. I think it's can be very helpful, but there's 22% that think that it's unprofessional and should be avoided. So that's an interesting screenshot or snapshot, sorry, of where we are with this audience, and that's worth knowing. What we're going to do is we're going to run the same question. We've got another question in the middle as well on a slightly different topic, but we're going to run the same question at the end, and it'll be interesting to see what the contrast is and see whether I've managed to change any particular views on that. So that will be quite interesting. So it'll be worth hanging around to the end. So anyway, the first awful story, I think, is how can you go from success to disaster in 30 years? In 1986, I went over to St. Louis and saw Alex Shigo give a great talk on tree biology, came back to the UK, and then managed to organize the first tree biology workshop in 1988. And it was a great event. And I think Alex was so successful. You can see actually on the screen there, you can see that one of the diagrams is about topping and you know, it was one of the issues that he came up with. And he was so successful at trying to persuade professionals that it was, and the public as well, that it was the wrong thing to do. That effectively it stopped the practice pretty much, or it certainly, there may still be parts of it, it may still happen a little bit, but he was very, very successful at getting rid of, you know, at making it something that shouldn't be done. And I think what that did is, unfortunately, that the perception that it's an unprofessional way to do it, it's bad for trees, has stigmatized certainly topping, and probably quite rightly so, many people would say. But unfortunately, what it's done as well is it's also rubbed off on the other, probably more useful, less severe forms of topping or crown reduction. So what we're seeing is that there's a widespread aversion to actually any crown reduction at all. And what that does is remove some very, very useful tools from the arborist toolbox. So that's the first sad story. And I think he was so successful that there's been some great publications out there. This one's from ISA, but why topping hurts trees. So he was very effective at getting that message across. But the unintended consequence is that quite often now that technique is removed from the arborist toolbox, and we should be thinking about that in slightly more detail, I think. And I'm not talking here about some airy-fairy idea. This is actually happening on the ground. I was in New Zealand last year speaking at a conference there, and after the conference we went for a trip and went to Christchurch Botanic Gardens. This is a great silver lime, so Tilia tomentosa, and it's a big tree. You can see at the base there, it's probably getting close to 3 meters across, 2.5 meters across. And under normal circumstances, you wouldn't want to do too much to it. But what happens is that if you can see here a bit closer, and you may not be able to catch it on the screen, but there's a fungal bracket between those two forks. The forks, the unions are potentially weak, and there's other fungal brackets around as well. And we looked at this tree and thought, well, this is obviously, this is a prime candidate for some sort of crown reduction to try and keep it. And we were talking to the managers there, and they really didn't like the idea at all. So that was a bit of a surprise, because we've used crown reduction and severe crown reduction in some instances on a regular basis to try and deal with these issues. So that was a surprise. I think the second awful story is how Vanity has ruined the day. And a good analogy to it is where we like to have our gardens neat and tidy, and that's spilled over to the way that we manage our roadside verges. And so we see roadside verges mown to death with all the impact of the biodiversity loss from that cut grass and all the flowers that are lost from that. And all of this mindless mowing has a significant adverse impact on ecological diversity. And it's basically the tidy garden syndrome, where we've moved the ideas of having our garden neat and tidy out into the countryside. And nature isn't an artificial tidy garden, it's a highly organized system that works. And we should be mindful of that. And a great example of that is Great Dixter, one of our wonderful houses here, in wonderful sort of homes here in the UK. And what you can see in this is that the garden, look, but not all the grass is cut. There's a great mixture. There's dead trees and everything else in here. And it's full of what may on the surface seem like superficial imperfections, but actually, there's dead trees around, uncut grass. But nature's full of local imperfections, but the wider picture, it all fits together. And that's what we should be thinking about. We should be looking at the wider picture. And that's where we've fallen foul, I think, as arborists, because we've had this idealistic view of what trees should be like, a balanced, regular, balanced crown, and a single straight trunk, and a tree lacking in any imperfections at all. So we have this idealistic view. And we see that in many places. This is the yew trees at Hampton Court Palace. They're 300 years old. And this idealistic view of what a tree is doesn't transpose well into the wider environment. And, when we have this ideal that all trees should be nicely balanced, but this is a hawthorn tree on Beachy Head in the most severe conditions. And I put it onto Twitter as an interesting tree. And, what people, the general public are not that obsessed with perfection. They actually like interesting things that are slightly different. So I think we need to change our view of what a good tree is. A good tree is a survivor, not necessarily one that's perfectly formed and free of imperfections. And when you do start to top trees, this is the problem. You look at things from one perspective. Oh, we should prune trees properly so there aren't any defects. But those defects that you get from branch failures and from improper pruning actually provide habitat for a range of wildlife and greatly increase the habitat diversity. So these rainbow lorikeets in Australia, but we still have, in Britain, we have our woodpeckers as well. And if you get rid of all the imperfections, you get rid of the places that these animals and wildlife can live. So you reduce the wildlife diversity. And not only that, but even even when trees are dead, they're teeming with life. And if you look at them, and that life is essential, because what's happening is the decay is feeding back into the ecosystem, keeping that ecosystem going. And that's one of the things that we should be really thinking hard about. And it's one of the things, a main theme through what I'm going to say today. And this has been mainstream thinking in many, for many people for quite a long time. So here we have Great Windsor Park and a dead stump that's been left for a long time, and Ted Green and Bill Cathcart, and this is Keith Saker here and Alex Saytel from Canada when he was over visiting. But just the importance of keeping trees like this, not only in woodland habitats and in rural environments, but also in urban environments. And it was great when I went to Pune in India last year. I went and spoke at a conference in Mumbai, and I went to a college in Pune, which is about 100 miles outside of Mumbai. And fantastic to see in this college that a dead stump had been left in the grounds in a very prominent position. Someone knew what they were doing and had a great consideration for the ecological importance of these things. So, we need to broaden our perspective. And, this is when I go to places, this is Ilminster in Somerset, and you see this and you think of the huge loss that's happened here. First of all, the thing had been felled, an absolute bodge, but it didn't need to be felled. That could have been left standing. And the value of standing wood like this is huge. It can contribute to the ecosystem for decades and sometimes centuries as well, like we saw in that oak just before. So this stuff's going on. These people out there are actually advising this sort of thing, and have got no real conception about the wider impact of what they're doing. And, when you go to RHS Wisley, is probably one of the premier garden showcase institutions in the world. And when you see them leaving stumps like this, that there's something in it, and perhaps we should be giving it a bit more thought in the way that we look at things. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize there. And then the third story is young professions are always trying hard to establish their credentials, to make themselves known and to be seen as professional. And one of the ways the superficial ways of creating the air of being professional is to increase the complication of things. And what we've done in arboriculture, and specifically in risk management, has made it so complicated that it's almost beyond the reach of the ordinary people who are out there carrying out risk assessments on a daily basis. And lawyers are a great example of it. They complicate the language. It means other people can't do it very easily, don't understand it, and then they can get more money for the services they offer. The role of us as experts should be to simplify these complex ideas into concepts and ideas that people can understand relatively easily without having a doctorate in statistics to do it. So we've lost our way there. We should be making these processes much more simple, I think. And the result of it is that you throw your hands up in the air, and what happens is this is too difficult. I'm going to take the better safe than sorry course of action, and we'll fell that tree. And that's what we're seeing almost on a daily basis, is trees being felled because arborists are so worried about the consequences of being caught out and the liability. And I can talk about liability in questions if that's an issue, because I think it's a really important thing to know about. And thank goodness that we've got, these are illustrations of the types of things you get, the slight, imperfections and problems with a tree. And the safest bet is just to cut it down. And thank goodness that we've got institutions like the National Trust here. This is Dunham Massey. I was there 3 or 4 months ago. They've got a lot of large mature beech trees. And, they don't just see a problem and take the easy course out and fell the tree. They actually investigate it in a bit more detail. And this is the shot of the tree from a distance. And what's interesting here is that tree has been severely crown reduced in the past. So probably a third of its crown, it's been 30% reduced. So that is topping. That's severe crown reduction, and that is the perfect way to manage this tree. And what they will do there is that as the problems with it get worse, instead of felling the tree, they'll continue to reduce it over the decades, so that in the end, the tree may even be dead, but you've still got the habitat sitting there. Now, that can be done in an urban environment as well as a rural environment, and that's one of the things that we should be thinking about. So those are the horror stories, I suppose, of where we've gone wrong in arboriculture, just a quick tour of them. What I wanted to do was look at what some of the myths and facts around crown reduction and just see where we get to. First of all, there's something fundamental here, that young and old trees are different. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Mimicking crown reduction, severe crown reduction mimics the natural process. We'll look at that. Dynamic damping is something I don't really understand that well, but it's an important thing, and why should we intervene? The first thing is that there's a big difference. One of the things that Alex didn't get across very well is that there's a difference between mature trees and young trees. These are the same species. It's a Scots pine. This is a young tree, probably 10 or 15 years old, and this one's 70 or 80 years old. And the way that those trees are managed is completely different. And if you look at them a bit more closely, there is an analogy with people. You know, young kids can take almost anything that's thrown at them, same as that tree. You could cut nearly all the branches off of that, or a lot of it off, and it would still make it. But the problem is, as you get older, you become more vulnerable. People become vulnerable to disease and debilitation. Trees get bigger and they become vulnerable to falling apart. And that's what we have to try and manage. There's a difference between managing big trees and small young trees. And that's something that's been missed by many arborists around the world. So, severe crown reduction, oh my goodness, we shouldn't do it. You know, this is what's going on when you look at these big trees. This one's in Althorpe House, it's an oak tree, and it's probably 600 years old. And that has lost nearly all of its large branches. That's nothing short, that's just natural topping. Those branches have just been ripped off, and that is a fine tree that's got hundreds of years left in it and huge amounts of habitat. So, you know, topping isn't that bad in every instance. And then you see as oak trees get older, this is in Windsor Great Park, this one's probably 800 years old, exactly the same. They can keep going for a long, long time. So it doesn't kill them, it doesn't finish them off. In fact, it provides huge amounts of habitat. And in the right circumstances, it's not that bad at all. And then you get to, this is another one in Windsor Great Park. We know that this one is about 1,000 years old because it's been carbon dated. And, you know, this tree has lost all of its significant branches a long time ago, and it's regrowing its crown. So those are, you know, something that we should be thinking about, is that topping is only mimicking something that happens in nature. So it's not actually that bad. Now, one of the best, most original papers that we had in the last 20 years was in 2003 from Ken James about dynamic damping. And I'm not going to go into it because I don't understand it too much, or not understand it too much, but it's complex to be doing right at the moment. But what's interesting is that there are various interpretations of it. And what I was interested in was I was in court or in a legal hearing a couple of years ago, and where an expert was asked the question, you know, if we reduce the length of that branch, if that branch was pruned back, would it increase the risk of it failing? And I was thinking, well, no way, of course it's not good, it's going to decrease the risk. And actually his response was, yes, it will increase the risk of failing. Now, I was staggered at that, because that didn't reflect what I'd seen. And that's over 30 or 40 years of pruning. And we've done lots and lots of crown reduction. And, you know, I've never seen, that I can recall, a branch that's been reduced in length actually break because of that work that's been done on it. So something's wrong in the way this has been interpreted. And I don't know what it is. And I think we should hopefully be getting some clarifications from Ken James in some publications to come. But I thought, you know, that's just my view. And so what we've got is another poll, and just to see whether that's the experience of other people out there. Now, my experience is if a branch is reduced in length, I can't recall any instances of that actually resulting in the branch breaking. In most instances, it stopped it breaking. Now, I don't know what your experience is, and so this is a bit tricky, because a tricky question to ask, because it's like live science. We've got 500 people who've got a vast amount of experience between them, and this is a question that we don't know the answer to. So the question is, have you ever seen a branch that was pruned to reduce its length fail directly because of that work? Yes, many times, lots of times have you seen that? Yes, possibly a few times, but not very often. No, I haven't seen it. And if you're not sure. So Sophie, we've, that poll's up there. And well, that's I can tell you that's quite a relief, really, because because that is obviously there's people that aren't sure. It's going to take some people by surprise, and maybe you don't have experience. But yes, many times. Well, that's a very low number, a few times, and I think most people are saying no, they haven't. That's something for all of the people that are skeptical about branch reduction and crown reduction to think very hard about, because all of you people out there, that's a vast amount of experience that's sitting there, and that's a very interesting answer that we've got from that. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that, to participate in that one. And then finally, why intervene? And, you know, basically, whether you're in the southern hemisphere or northern hemisphere, we have hurricanes, typhoons, storms. We get snow as well here, so snow can accumulate on branches. Cedars particularly, and we'll look at them a little bit more, have got plate-like branch structures, and they really are susceptible to snow. And you can have a fantastic tree like this, and you get one fall of snow, and that's what you've got left. Now, some people may say that's just nature doing its course, and that's fine, I can live with that. But, you know, sometimes, you know, we want to try and keep some of these fantastic trees for future generations. And can you do things? Is crown reduction a method of doing that? And that's something to think about. Here's a great example here. This is a wonderful cedar. It's probably 130, 140 years old, a Norman church in the background. So really a lovely setting and a fantastic tree. The last thing you want to do is do any pruning on it, really. But then I went back last year, we'd had a heavy wind, and literally, you know, a third of the crown had gone. And this is it. This is the bit that was on the ground, and this is bigger than it looks. It's a meter across this, or 3 feet across this branch. And that's a visitor, Krista Brathen from Vancouver last year. She was over here, and she gives you some perspective on how big that is. That is a massive branch to come off, and that tree is really now compromised in terms of its long-term viability. So I want to just, that's the reasons why we should be doing it. I'm just a quick overview. I want to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes now just going through some examples. That's the doom and gloom of it, to try and some happy endings, as it were. The first one that we're going to look at is, you know, where it's been done and where it's worked okay. And just to give you some ideas, I mean, the great thing about seeing what other people are doing is it gives you ideas, and then you think, oh, I may be able to apply that to a particular problem that I got. So the first one is Royal Holloway, just south of London. And this is a cedar tree here, which is, we know it's 100 years old, or just over 100 years old. And it looks pretty good, in pretty good shape. If you look closely at it, you will see that this tree has been crown reduced quite significantly. So 4 meters have been taken off of it, 10, 15 feet, something like that. And what this will do is this is going to stop this tree suffering and falling apart from storm damage. And that's one of the primary objectives of managing these trees in this way. So a really important, just a simple example of where it can be done and still look really good. The next case study, we're going to go to right over the other side of the world, to New Zealand, to Masterton, which is in North Island, just north of Wellington, the capital. And this is a case study sent to me by Richie Hill. This is a cedar tree again. They grow big in New Zealand. He heard this tree condemned because this is a before shot, but you can see it's lost a few branches. Maybe you can see it up there. And because it was beginning to lose branches, the recommendation was fell it. He stepped in and said, I think I can do something different. And that's actually what he's done. And that is a great result. That takes vision and foresight to do that. And you know what that's done is probably allowed that tree to have you know, decades, if not centuries of life left in it, whereas it was going to be condemned and felled. So that's definitely something to think about. Next example, in Edinburgh, the Royal Botanic Gardens there. These are great places to go to. If you go to the one of the entrances, this is a beech tree, a Fagus sylvatica. They don't take pruning very easily. You can prune them. But this tree has been crown reduced quite significantly. Will Hinchcliffe is the arborist there. And I was there a few years ago, and that tree looks fantastic now as it stands. But those branches have been reduced by probably 20 or 30%. So 3, 4, 5 meters, 10, 15 feet, something like that. And yet that tree still looks really good. And when you get these places like Botanic Gardens starting to do this sort of work, then, that is a very good sign, because, these are these people are at the cutting edge of arboriculture. And this is great, great work from them. And we should all be mindful of it. Next case study is one that I've worked on over a long period of time in Ilex Way in Worthing on the south coast. And you can see that there used to be, well, there still is, it's a hospital now, but this used to be a stately home that the Queen Mother used to visit regularly, so part of our royal family. And it's got about 1 kilometre long, so just over half a mile double avenue of holm oaks. So Quercus ilex, which are evergreen oaks. And it's by the sea, and they do very well there. And just a little bit closer there, in the early 1980s, this is when I worked on these trees, some of them, you can see that they're in a middle row there, and there's a road each side and lots of residential development and cars right next to them. And a few had failed, cars were squashed, and they had to do something about it. And just to give you a bit of background, this is what it looked like in the early days when the Queen Mother was living there, or not, this was before that, but it was an avenue, a stately entrance to this stately home. And it gives you an idea of what these trees looked like then. This was about 100 years ago. You go there now, I was there with Michael Richardson a couple of years ago, who was visiting from Canada, and there are fungal brackets all over these trees and lots of defects, and you can see lots of problems with them. But holm oak is a particularly resilient tree. And in 1985, there was a specification to crown reduce all of these trees by 10 to 15%. So that was 3, 4 meters, something like that, maybe not quite that much, but in some instances it was quite a lot. So that was the work we did on them. It was the biggest tree surgery contract that had ever been given in Britain at the time. It's 17 weeks, and there were 6 of us working all the time. So it gives you an idea of the thing. And this is the type of work that we did. So pretty severe crown reduction. I'm not quite, well, it is topping really. But that was what we did, and a lot of material came off. And that's what these trees look like now, probably 30, 35 years later. Hardly any of them have fallen down, and they're all still looking pretty good and really still an asset for the community. And we got a letter from the Queen Mother thanking us for the work that we did on that. So that was something we were very proud of a long time ago. So I'm not just sitting here in my comfy chair telling you this stuff. I'm saying this is what we've done. This is what we've seen. This experience matters because that's what's going on out there. And there are plenty of examples where there's been severe crown reduction that has actually meant trees are here now, whereas they would have been gone in the past if that work hadn't been done. So I want you to think about that. Next case study is from New Zealand as well. We go to Nelson, just at the top end of South Island. Fantastic place. I was there with a friend of mine, with Philip Van Wassenaar, my brother, and Brad Cadwallader last year, and we went on a tour looking at these trees. And these trees grow big here. This is a Californian redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. It's probably not quite that there now, but it's nearly 50 meters tall. 50 meters is 170, 180 feet. So these are big trees. And it was in a residential area. This is a shot from 1994. And this is the New Zealand Tree Register. And you can see, I'm just going to go on to there, but you can see that it's measured at 48 meters and in terms of height. So this is a whopping great big tree. And it was important as a heritage tree because it was over 100 years old. This is Brad giving you an idea of the scale of the thing, but it's growing in a residential setting. And in 2007, the branches started falling off, and they were starting to cause pretty severe damage. So what do you do? What he did was, instead of felling the tree, because there were calls to fell the tree, is that he basically said, well, if we reduce the length of these branches, actually, we stand a chance of being able to keep this tree. So this is an image of the work being carried out. And this is, this is nearly a 50-meter tree, 170 feet. That's a big tree, big for Britain anyway. And you get some big ones over there in New Zealand. And so they reduced the size of all those branches around the tree as all the way up. And this is a shot of it that Brad sent me this year. And you can see that's what it looks like. And you can see on the left-hand image, that's where the storm damage is starting to happen, and they were getting worried. And you can see now that the branches all around there have been retained, and that's started to fill out probably about 10 or 12 years after. So this is a great example of creative, innovative thinking coming from New Zealand. And, you know, while I was there last year, we saw literally just down the road another sequoia that hadn't been pruned. And literally in those storms in 2008, it had lost some big branches up here that came down and took half the side of the tree off. So, you know, this stuff, this is a really good example of a pruned and unpruned tree and the impacts that it can have on it. And one of them is going to last a long time and the other one isn't. So it's interesting to think about. And then finally, just in terms of just trying to set the scene and give you a sort of range of examples, I suppose, to show you what can be done. This is Litchardminster, which is in Dorset. It's in a school actually, and it's a school or an old building, a stately type home, a manor house that was converted into a school. And in the grounds there were these fantastic cedars that we know were about 140 years old. So cedars again, but what had happened is this tree had been condemned, and it had Phaeolus swinitzi, which is a fungus over here, which is quite aggressive. But you know, you look at the trunk of that tree; it had really good root growth, structural root support. These were only small pockets of decay, and I basically looked at it, and the owners of the tree, because they bequeathed the school to the council, or bequeathed the grounds to the council, but they still lived on the site as part of the deal, and they remember this tree from their childhood, and they were going, we don't want it to be felled. They'd had another one, they'd had a tomograph done on another one adjacent to it. The tomograph came back and said, oh, it's really badly decayed. They felled it, and there was no problems with it at all, which is one of the problems with tomographs and big trees, because the splits can give you misleading readings. And they just said, we don't want to lose this tree. It's memorable, it's important to us. And so so I looked at it and thought, well, okay, well, this is, we've got to do something here, and it needs to be pretty severe. And that is the tree looking at it. I mean, it's a fantastic tree when you look at it, but it's got this decay in the base and a few problems as well in the crown, a few other problems. So basically I just said, well, we can do a severe crown reduction. This is an alternative to felling. It's not something you'd normally do, but we needed to do something. This was a school with children around it all the time. We couldn't take the risk of just not doing anything and leaving it to fall apart. So this is what we did. We got a crane in and we reduced it, and we reduced it significantly. It was down to 12 meters because they could put a 12-meter fence around it. We wanted to make sure if it fell over, it wasn't going to, reach too far beyond the fence. And so the crane was there because you need to lift stuff out, because it's critical when you're dealing with a tree like this is to keep as much of the foliage close to the trunk as possible, because these don't have dormant buds. Once there's no branches, then that's it, there's no more going to come. So you need every single branch you can get, and to drop this stuff down through and break branches off would have been deadly. Just to give you an idea of the size of those cuts, so this is topping, this is the worst you can ever do to a tree. This is the team of guys that did it. I'm really not to see them. They were great, actually, and they did a really good job. But just to look at the scale of the thing, the value in these trees is in the magnificence of the trunk, how spectacular it is. And it just takes your breath away when you see it. This branch to the side is way over a meter. It's 4 foot in diameter, massive tree, and hugely valuable. And this is what it looked like when it was done. And is it that bad? I do have to say this is from the best angle, so it didn't look that good from every angle, so it's slightly biased. But this was in 2013, just after the work was finished, and then I went back 3 or 4 years ago. I haven't been back recently, so I hope the thing hasn't fallen down. But in 2017, and the school had put a fence around it 12 meters out, and the tree was still looking pretty good. And what I think we'll do in terms of managing that in the future is we'll slowly but surely reduce the crown of some of these longer branches back, and try and encourage those internal branches to grow, and just keep it and keep cutting it back until we get over 20, 30, 50, 100 years, till we probably just have a stump there, and then that will be a relic, which will be something to remind people of things into the past, which is really quite interesting. So that's just a excuse me, a massive sort of skim through, I suppose, or just a very, very quick scoot over the issues that we need to be thinking about. And the issue is, if you what can we do as individuals to try and, how can we do, we're not helpless, what can we do? And I'm going to look at that in a minute. But the problem is that if you fell trees like this, so trees that are mature or have a few problems, and this isn't terminal by any means, and yet this tree has been felled, it's cheap, it's easy, I don't want to take the risk, no, let's get rid of it. And, if you fell trees like that, you don't get trees like this. And this is a 500 or 600 year old oak tree, the Moores Court oak at Ringwood in Hampshire. And it's not in good shape. There's lots of issues that we have to try and deal with. But if you fell trees when they're mature because they have a few problems, then they don't have the opportunity to develop on to become the veteran and ancient trees that give us so much pleasure and are really so valuable to the community, because they're living links with people who are no longer with us. So really, really important. So this is just a final shot in terms of, how things can go so badly wrong. This was probably one of our greatest heritage trees in the UK, the Duke of Wellington cedar, and it was felled. It did have problems. I'd crown reduced that by 3 to 4 meters. Took me 3 days to do it in 1983, and it survived all the storms. And then, unfortunately, the National Trust, the local decision makers in the National Trust, decided to fell it. And unbelievable. I still feel sick about it. And it just shows you how things can go so badly wrong when you get people who really don't know what they're doing, really trying to make decisions on very, very important trees like this. So what can we do, all of us? Well, as consultants, if you're out there advising, please, felling is the last resort. There's lots of options before you get to felling. And, if it's a case of severe crown reduction or topping, and that's going to save the tree or prevent the tree being felled and retain it for decades, then surely that's got to be something worth thinking about. If you're a contractor going out there, I see it all the time, these stumps being cut down. Ecology is critically important. Please think about ecology. Try and persuade tree owners to keep stumps. It can be done. Keep stumps, trunks, keep them alive if possible, but don't just fell everything and make it all neat and tidy. And tree officers, so the municipal people looking after trees, you should be promoting pruning as the intermediate to felling, and felling should just be the last resort. This tree here was felled because inexperienced council officers were bullied by a big major landowner into agreeing to it being felled, which is just outrageous. And then if you're an enthusiast, then constantly keep on and check what's going on and hold these people to account. The community, councils, municipalities, they're managing these environmental assets on your behalf, and just make sure that they're doing it properly and they're not just taking the easy way out. And I see that on a daily basis. So that's it pretty much. If you want to find out more about this stuff, then go to our website and click on the resources tab, or follow my stuff at Twitter. And then, John, I'm 10 minutes now over, and it's just the poll for the last time. So this is the poll we did at the beginning, and the reason for it as well is just to see whether, having seen some of the examples that I've shown you and listened to perhaps my rather unusual viewpoint, I suppose, whether I've managed to persuade people to think differently. So fill it out again and let's see what the results are, and then we'll talk about it in questions. Okay, right. So what we've got is yes is 92%, and that's moved from 78 to 92%. and no's, which were 22%, have now gone down to 8%. So I'm going to have to take that as a result for me. If it had been the other way, I'd have been off out to top myself. Because it's not just trees that can be topped. Anyway, John, thanks very much. I'll turn off my screen share now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeremy, as ever. The chat, I think we've had more discussion in the chat for this one than for any of the other 27 odd webinars we've done. Please do, everybody out there in chat land, feel free to make your comments, because we always send the chat around to our presenters afterwards. So feedback is always welcomed. Do remember, when you're putting stuff in the chat, that we need you to put all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it. There's a lot of great comments going in there. Some of them are just going to panelists though, so please make sure you shift that around. An apology to some of you. I made a joke about it at the start, but it actually happened. We hit 500 quite quickly, and it turns out our Zoom license only does 500. So thanks to some great work behind the scenes by Sophie and Sarah, thank you both. We're now up, I don't normally say the numbers, but we're now up to 623. So I'll just throw that out there to you. So apologies to the 120 odd of you who had to join slightly late. And also, as we've got such a big audience, I'll take the opportunity to say, please remember, sign up next week. Rachel Sheridan, Paul Mandabondabo, it's going to be a cracker. But first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Andrew Koeser to the stage. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Koeser. I'm at the University of Florida. And I think you've seen a number of presentations from a good friend of mine, Rob Northrup, if any of you have been on this series quite a bit. And I welcome the opportunity to present some of my research today. I'll start with a picture of a really kind of a beautiful live oak that's in my own neighborhood of the world. This is the Barrell Oak in Safety Harbor in the Tampa Bay area. And you see there's a fence around this. And you know, some people might think, you know, just the casual bystander, that this is a fence to protect people from a tree that could be potentially hazardous. But as we know, this is the tree that is being protected from us, from our love, from our fear, from everything. This is a tree that had been compacted and trampled and loved to death. And eventually they had to put a surrounding around it to keep people from killing it. So, which is a really kind of a nice metaphor for risk assessment in general. A lot of times the trees have much more to fear from us than we fear from them, as the risk of harm for most trees is relatively rare and low. Tree risk assessment is ultimately governed by a number of things. This is a little recap for folks. I know most of you know this. You have a really engaged audience I can see from the comments section, but just to get everyone up to speed, you know, we're looking at the potential of a tree or tree part to fail. And I put this thing first because I first presented this research down in New Zealand at a Wind and Trees conference. But that is by far not the first thing you're normally looking at when you look at a tree to see if it's a risk of harm to the general public. What we normally look at is, will the tree fall? When it falls, if it falls, will it hit something? So we have two different settings here. The one at the top is Dale Mabry, a major road in Tampa, which several times a day becomes a standing parking lot for the general traffic that go through it. If you contrast that to the logging road that's in the picture below, or the country road that's below, you know, just two trees, given all their similarities and being completely the same, the one with more targets would be more dangerous just because it has the potential to hit things. And then when it comes to consequences of failure, what will happen if a limb or a part of the tree fails and hits something? Size matters. You know, when you have the picture in the beginning and you have a branch at the top where the branch is hitting that tree, you know, that person's having a bad day, but not as bad of a day as the person of a similar vehicle in the bottom picture where the size of the branch is much bigger and the force is just crushing their frame. So there's a lot of different risk assessment methods out there. I know that in the UK, folks generally work with QTRA or VALID. In the US, we did a survey, and the number one risk assessment method used in the US is no method. And number two would be TRAC, and followed by Matheny and Clark. And some folks use our Forest Service method. You know, a lot of these things have evolved over time, but even in their evolution, the general inputs that go into them have stayed the same. All of these methods above, you know, including the P&W method, which Julian Dunstan put together, which was a precursor to track. All of them have target assessment, likelihood of failure assessment, and consequences of failure assessment. And all these things have various concerns. We want to assess our risk assessment methods and make sure that they're feasible and they're useful to our needs as arborists. So if you see here, this is from Martin Norris's thesis research, Martin was a master's student down at the University of Melbourne and the urban forester in the area. And he did a really nice write-up of what makes an ideal risk assessment method. And I know that folks like David Evans and I have just jumped on this because it's a really nice piece of work. Risk assessment methods to be ideal should be feasible. The data needs to be collected and easily collected. There's all sorts of stuff that we do in science with fancy cameras from NASA and everything that just will never make it mainstream because you just can't do it in the field. It should be economical. So it should be something you can do relatively cheaply, given the price of the tree, so that you're not spending more money than the tree is worth or the risk is warranting. And then these are things that are kind of political or of the management side of things. From a scientist, I'm really interested in this right here, which is repeatability. Can multiple arborists with the same training get a similar result? And we've been doing all sorts of studies on this, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But repeatability is essentially precision. So we have two targets in the picture to the right. And you see precise means having things in a tight group. But that doesn't always mean that you're on target. You can have very charismatic trainers. You can have awesome, well-done training that pulls everyone away from the actual target. And that's a worry. We want to make sure that we can assess accuracy as well as precision. And getting to that point, what is accuracy? That's validity. That is, your conclusions actually reflect reality. Maybe one day we'll find that the place where our dreams and reality collide, and with risk, maybe it's when our fears and our nightmares meet reality. Are our perceptions of risk in line with the actual risk of the tree? And so we've been chipping away at this with our research a little bit. This is a study I did with Tom Smiley, looking at multiple arborists looking at the same trees, trying to see how repeatable the results are. Because, as I'll tell you in a little bit, getting at accuracy is not an easy task, right? Some things need to fall into play for that to happen. But in the meantime, I still need to get tenure. I still need to keep my job and write, publish or perish, right? So we chipped away at the replication part of this problem. So in this instance, we had nearly 300 arborists from across the United States and Canada that worked with Bartlett trees, assessing 3 trees at each site that we went to, and looking at the same 3 trees, trying to see what factors influence their risk ratings and then what they would prescribe for mitigation. And this picture to the right, that kind of Venn diagram thing, is what we call variance partitioning. So we did a very simple model, and we want to say of all the noise out there with the ratings, why some people have a 2, and some people have a 4, or whatever it was. When we look at all those differences in the ratings, how much of that came from the arborist themselves, and how much came from the actual tree they were looking at? And with just those 2 simple factors, 2 things that a scientist would never normally just try to make a prediction on because it only applies to your sample, we found that about, I think it's like 40% here, actually nearly 50% of the variation was explained by those 2 things. But the kicker for this was that the arborist actually explained 4 times more of that noise than the tree they were looking at. So the person was 4 times more important than the actual tree when it came to creating a risk rating. Risk ratings are a good proxy for what the decision would be, but they're numbers, right? And people interpret those numbers and those final values, if they're an ordinal value like good, high, medium, low, whatever, they interpret that a little bit differently. So we took this a step further, and we actually modeled with multinomial regression. So like seeing if people fell into category A, B, C, red, yellow, blue. There's no order to this. what different prescribed measures the arborists were suggesting when they looked at these various trees, given their training, given their inherent risk biases on a little survey we gave them on like health risk perception and monetary risk perception, and things like, do they own a house? Do they have assets that could be at stake? Do they have children? And it was pretty interesting. So we found when we did our analysis of these 300 individuals, that an arborist that had the ISA certification, the International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist certification, they were 4 times more likely to retain a tree and just monitor it than do some sort of active kind of management, such as removal. And if you added a little bit more training to that equation, if you had people that had the track training, the tree risk assessment qualification, which is kind of akin to the QTRA, now these folks were 6 times more likely to just say monitor the tree rather than do anything active, do any kind of cutting to mitigate a risk that they perceived. On the flip side, I, as a parent myself, I have 4 daughters, I found this quite intriguing. Arborists, when we kept everything else constant, their training, their gender, their experience, because we even asked that question, we found that arborists that had children were 3 times more likely to remove a tree than do something less active, like just monitor that tree. Just because they can play, in my mind, it's because they can, everything's dangerous when you have kids, right? Like, I never really worried about outlets or corners on tables or things like that until my kids started poking things into them or hitting their face on them and stuff like that, we also looked at repeatability with different levels of assessment. So this is a study where we had people look at trees with a limited visual assessment, a basic assessment like a 360, just visual cues, let them throw a mallet in there, drill in the tree with a resistograph, and we showed them how to interpret. We actually interpreted the output as a group. So they all had the same interpretation of what it meant, but then they had to put it in their mind, like, what does 70% decayed mean? That kind of thing. And then the same thing with tomographs. And we found that things are pretty repeatable at the basic level. This is what we call a violin plot, showing kind of a distribution of the ratings. And in almost every tree, there was a nice tight clustering around the basic assessments. People were very consistent when they were doing basic assessments. When we threw in advanced assessment techniques, things got a lot more variable often. In this example, there's a nearly 4-way split between this resistograph assessments of that tree and the tomography assessments. And it's because it muddies the water. We have so many guides and stuff that show us how to visually assess trees, and the familiarity with these tools is much, much lower. Anyone who's bought a resistograph or tomography for the first time, they realize it. Like all those textbook examples you see in the literature, they're great, but in the real world, you get a lot of muddier situations that take a little bit more skill to assess and can kind of throw you for a loop. This tree right here looked pretty bad from the outside, had a lot of conchs and stuff, but it was a very rot resistant species. And even with the mallet, people started to realize that this thing was pretty solid. And in fact, our research here showed that the ratings of the mallet were no different statistically from drill ratings or tomography ratings overall for the trees that we looked at. Other things that we can assess for, so that was assessing reproducibility and just are things consistent, which is a key thing that we want in our risk assessment methods. You don't want 2 arborists looking at the same tree on opposite sides of the courtroom saying this tree was going to fall or this tree was perfectly fine. It looks bad. It reflects a breakdown in our knowledge of tree risk. Things that we can assess for accuracy are a little bit on the edges of the entire part of the risk. So we can easily assess with traffic counters the accuracy of our likelihood of a target being there, right? We can have people look at a scene, we can have them judge the occupancy of a site, and then compare that to actual recorded data using some pretty inexpensive traffic loggers. This one right here is about $3,000, which is not that inexpensive, but we created one in our lab that anyone can make with Amazon parts for like $400 or even $200 if you're really a good shopper. So and the other thing is consequences of failure. Well, the actual interpretation of our consequences of failure data for those of us that use track is a little bit to the assessor. Folks that use QTRA and valid, it's very much based on the size of the part, right? So if we can test, and we've done this, to see how good arborists are at estimating diameters and fall distances for tree parts at a distance, which is a skill in itself. Measuring a deep tape and getting diameter on, at breast height over and over again in your head, right, is one thing. But measuring diameters from afar is a different skill altogether. So we can do this really easily. We don't need any special circumstances. How do you assess the accuracy of likelihood of failure? That's a different question altogether. This is a laurel oak in Tampa. We watched a squirrel go in right where we're looking and pop out the top of the tree. The thing was completely hollow. Is that tree going to fail in a storm or not? And in Florida, we have hurricanes pretty regularly, right? So to do that, you need to assess the accuracy of likelihood of failure. You need, first of all, a risk assessment of a tree that's risk assessed. You need a storm to occur during the time frame. If you're risk assessing for a typical thunderstorm in your area, you need that thunderstorm to occur during your time frame for your risk assessment. So time frame comes into it. If you have a 3-year time frame, you have a little bit more time to make this occur. We used to do 5-year time frames, but we're shying away from that. If you have a 1-year time frame on your assessment, your window is quite short to get that storm that you need. And then you need the money to go out and pay people to risk assess trees that have already been risk assessed, which is harder to do. And with our funding agencies as they are, they're too slow to get it done in a meaningful manner. So we have to kind of just work with partners and have funding that they're ready for this kind of thing. So can we predict tree failure? So there are questions for this. Given all of those conditions that need to occur, and given the kind of the hanging question of, like how accurate is likelihood of failure, can we actually predict tree failures using our current knowledge in the industry? And second, one of the questions for this research that I'm going to show you today is what defects are the most important with regard to wind-induced tree failure, which is the most common in my area and where we have hurricanes to give us the storms we need. So looking into the literature, there isn't a lot of research on this. The one paper that I could actually turn to see anyone who has attempted to do this before was a paper by Hickman, Perry, and Evans in 1987. And actually in 1995 is when they published the final results. So they assessed about 700 trees in California, and they used their own internal system for rating oak failure potential in a park system that was a natural park system that actually let trees fail on their own before they did any kind of cleanup work. So that was really kind of a nice condition for them. They went back in 1994, and they found that of those nearly 700 trees, 60% or 8.6% had failed. So now you actually have a nice population. You need trees when you do this kind of work that fail and trees that don't fail. You can't just have, to do proper research, you need a control group and a non, the treatment group or the group that's actually going to do what you want it to do. And honestly, many times the trees that stay upright are the more interesting than the ones that fail, So here are their results. This is the system that they used. They looked at irrigation frequency. More equals bad because live oaks tend to not like a lot of moisture in the root system, the root zone. Irrigation pattern, if there was irrigation against the trunk, it was a bad scenario. How much soil was covered by pavement? How many roots were cut? Was there decay or wounds or whatever in the butt of the tree, the trunk of the tree, the limbs of the tree? Was there a lean in the tree? How was the wind exposure of that tree? And was there any visual decline in the health of the tree? So looking at this 9-point system and giving it, how many years? It was about 7 years. So it was beyond the time frame that we would normally use in research. They found that 3 factors out of those were able to predict 78% of the failures in the trees that they were looking, those 2 species. It came down to decay in the trunk, lean in the trunk, and decline, visual decline in health. of the foliage and things like that. So what does 78% give us? Is that good? How does that relate to other forecasting in our lives? If you look here, this is 78% success is about on par with a 3-day forecast for precipitation, right? Like how accurate a weather person can be when predicting rain 3 days out. For those of you who like to gamble a little bit, it's way better than any of the models for sports events. This is a paper where they looked at different gambling models to predict German soccer or football player team outcomes or matches. Sorry. And their best model of predicting the winner had a 52.7% success rate, whereas the naive model, which is just picking the home team every time, was right more often than not as well. And who knows how much money went into the thought for the best model, right? So that noted, when we talk about prediction and forecasting, the results of Hickman et al., they were looking at the actual data that was collected to make predictions. They were not looking at any kind of human-made rating, right? They didn't look at what an arborist did with that information. They were just testing the actual inputs, right? So they made a mathematical model from the data collected, showing that the data they collected was valid and important to the system, but it did not test how assessors dealt with that information. So that's what we tried to get at with this study right here. So the first study we looked at was following Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew happened in 2016. It went past Cuba and Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and skirted the Atlantic edge of Florida, making contact in South Carolina, where Charleston is right there, and then kind of scraping the side of the United States right there in the Southern Atlantic. This was work done with Bartlett tree experts. They were our partners on this. We had 2 study sites. One was Charleston, South Carolina. One was Savannah, Georgia. 2 iconic southern towns where tourists flock. And so there was a lot of properties that they were managing, private properties and hospitals that we had access to for this study. So for these 2 cities, we had 6 sites, over 2,000 trees. The rub for this one is they only assessed trees that were big enough, surrounded by enough targets, or impaired enough, as far as structural integrity, to get them a higher risk rating. So anything that was small, remote, or just sound as a pound, they didn't record data on that. They just know that the tree was there. So we are missing a lot of the lower trees, but we do have the other 3 categories in our data set, which would be like the 3 higher risk ratings in this. There were 3 arborists that assessed. I don't know what the 4th one did, probably just stayed in the truck. They were all board certified master arborists. They had the track qualification, which is a tree risk assessment qualification from the International Society of Arboriculture. And they were registered consulting arborists with the American Society of Consulting Arborists. A lot of acronyms thrown around. Sorry about that. For the selection criteria for the study, it was pretty simple. We had to look at risk assessments that happened within 2 years prior to the storm, because that was the time I think they used a 3-year time frame. They had to work with properties that got the report that they were given and promptly did nothing with that information. I'm sure that never happens to anyone in the audience. So they looked for properties where they hadn't done any pruning or cabling or bracing or anything like that to mitigate any of the risks that were given to them. And we had to have sites that the property manager would allow us to get back onto, which is access when you're looking at public or private properties is a big thing in urban forestry research, in arboricultural research. So the storm itself was perfect. It was in that Goldilocks zone where it was more than, it's light winds, but it wasn't devastating. It wasn't a category 4 or 5 storm that would just level buildings and trees in its path. So that adds to the whole equation of how difficult this kind of research is to pull off, right? In Savannah, Georgia, we had, I'm not sure what you guys use, 53 miles per hour and 85 kilometers per hour winds. As it continued to hug the coast and lose momentum, by the time we got to Charleston, South Carolina, we were down to 43 miles per hour or 69 kilometers per hour. Given these wins, we had, and I am blocking my numbers here, so I gotta move this thing on my screen. Okay, so given these wins, we witnessed 1% whole tree failure, which includes trees that were just damaged to the point where removal was the option, right? It's not just trees that fell over, it's trees that lost a big part of their crown as well. 6% had branch failure and 93% had no damage. I'm not sure if those numbers surprise anyone, but when you look at things like the tree failure database that comes out there, you see a lot more whole tree failure in the data, but I think that's assessor bias, that when you pass a tree that's on the ground and you're going to collect data on it voluntarily, the ones that are like really dramatic are the ones that get your attention, where branch failures and smaller failures are much more common intuitively, right? So we used the ISA risk assessment methodology for this, or Bartlett did. These were the definitions at the time. I think they switched a little bit since then, but I'm not going to move some things around again because this is the one slide I actually read. So improbable would be a tree with an improbable likelihood of failure would be a tree that is not likely to fail during normal weather conditions and may not fail in extreme weather conditions given the specified time frame. A tree that is possible with regard to likelihood of failure rating is one that could be expected in extreme weather conditions, but probably won't happen during normal weather conditions. And for probable likelihood of failure, that tree is expected to fail under normal weather conditions given the specified time frame. And then this is the one that I know changed. Imminent would be essentially the failures happening before your eyes, or will be likely to occur in the near future, even without significant wind or increased loading. So given this, this is a slide that Tom Smiley put together for past presentations. And these are his thoughts. How many trees out of the population would you expect to fail given these categories? So given those definitions we just saw, in his mind, for imminent, you'd expect all or most of those trees to fail, right? Good. For probable, you would expect many of the trees to fail in a storm such as the one that we saw, right? For possible, you would expect some. Again, these are very broad categories. That's kind of where we are in our dealings without data. And then with improbable, you would expect few to none, right? So with regard to our results, getting a little bit of a lag here. Okay, here we go. So this figure right here, I'll shift things around again, or minimize them maybe. There we go. We have the ISA BMP rating, those terms that we just saw. Then we're going to show you the number of trees that were in that category, after the risk assessment and before the storm. Then we're going to show you out of those trees that were in that category originally, how many actually failed, the percent failure, and then we're going to do some statistics to show you if the percentages between each category were different from each other, okay? So for improbable, again, we were only looking at things that were not in remote locations, that were big, and that were not super sound. We only had, after all those kind of filterings, 23 trees that came out to be improbable. In reality, if they had included data on all the trees, you probably would have had 1,700 trees that were improbable given our data set, right? But which shows you that the vast majority of trees are low risk. But the way they calculated, the way they captured the data, I'm just going to show that right here, right? So of those 23 trees that they listed as being improbable, none of them failed in the storm. So 100% success rate, 0% failure rate. And then we then comparing that with the possible, which is where it is possible that trees could fail in extreme weather. We had 478 trees like that. 73 of those failed, and that was a failure percent of 15.3%. They were not statistically different because when you do like a binomial kind of test, this math with a 0 in here throws it for a loop, and it's impossible for it to compute, unfortunately. So these could be different. If it was like 1 out of 23, this would probably be a D right here, and different from the C. Probable. So we had, again, a smaller number. Every time you move up a level of risk rating, we have a smaller number of trees in that category. We had 155 trees there, 59 failed, either branch or whole tree, and 40% of them that's a 40% failure rate, which is different from the possible. And then finally, the imminent, they had 17 trees that were rated as imminent, 16 of them failed, nearly 95% of them failed at that point that we expected to. So as you can see here, there's a nice difference between the different ratings. Aside from the improbable, which we talked about why that isn't, there is statistical difference between all of the ratings, which is what you would want to see. If you have 3 ratings, or if you have 20 ratings, they need to be meaningful, right? And if if there is no discernment there, you have too much resolution, you have too many choices, and some of them should be clumped together in aggregates, right? So in Tom's mind, this is his slide again, he thought that imminent was spot on, possible was great, improbable was perfect, of course. In his mind, though, that having 38% of the probable fail was just not enough. You'd expect more than 50% in his mind to make that category meaningful. So he was a little surprised by that. So additional details based on our data set, just for you to know. The number of failed trees with no defects, only 10 of the 2,000 that we measured. The median type of defect, so for every tree usually had multiple defects, and for the median level, or almost nearly the average, would be 2 defects per tree as assessed, right? And the maximum number of defects recorded for a single tree was 6. So there's a lot of defects out there. Not all of them are leading to failures, essentially. The most common defect by far was the presence of codominant stems, and we only had 9.8% of those fail. In contrast, dead branches, which were pretty prevalent, but that had nearly double the failure rate. Deep planting had double the failure rate. Things like included bark had a really low failure rate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That was pretty surprising. And then decaying branches had a high failure rate, but they were pretty low, in the population in general. So when we modeled this all together, we did a logistic regression model to predict failure, no failure. And then we're talking in odds here, because that's how you talk about yes, no variables. So if you're better, if you like the horses, this might make sense to you. So for DBH, for every, increase in DBH for 1 centimeter, we'd have just a slightly bigger than 1-to-1 odds of increased likelihood of failure. So, a 1 centimeter increase wasn't that big, but if you compare like a really small tree to a really big tree, you can get some meaningful increases in likelihood of failure, which makes sense because bigger trees have more exposure to the wind. They have more limbs that can break off. It's intuitive. It's one of those checks in our data that shows us we're on the right path. I'm going to skip this one here, the included bark. We'll go down to dead branches. Again, dead branches, if you have a dead branch in the tree, you are 3.5 times more likely to have a failure than a tree that doesn't have a dead branch in our system that we showed in our data with the storms we had and the trees we had. Deep planting, this was our biggest thing. Trees that were planted deeply, the likelihood of failure was much bigger than trees that were not deeply planted. And I'm guessing it had to do with a vitality aspect of it. Trees that were just in general decline linked to that deep planting, because a lot of the trees like live oak and stuff, they just really don't handle that well. Severe root girdling, again, increased our likelihood of failure, and then wounds anywhere from pruning or past injury increased failure, right? We did see that trees with included bark actually had an increased likelihood of staying intact, which seemed counterintuitive, and it would surprise me, I know for sure, until we looked at our data, and the trees that were most likely to have that included bark were live oak. And they were also the most numerous trees in our system. And live oak, if you are not familiar with that tree, it's a tank, right? I mean, the USS Constitution, which is a warship, was created with live oak despite the hardship of working with that wood, which can be like 75 pounds a square foot. And they called it Old Ironsides because it was just so robust. So there's other things at play besides defect here. There's like a species and defect interaction. For those of you familiar with laurel oak and water oak, these are our live fast and die young kind of trees down here. These results do not surprise you. We had 43% failure for the laurel oak and 47% for the water oak, which, as you know, it's one of those duh things in a model. But again, we're always looking for signs that we're on the right track, and we want to confirm with a number things that we already know to make sure that there is some meaning behind our data and our models. Here's our next storm. So I was actually in Exeter, I believe, for Hurricane Irma. It was a storm the size of France, just barreling down on Florida, went right up the whole state. Rob Northrop was supposed to speak with me, and he took a later flight, and he got stuck in Tampa. So I sent him some nice pictures from the Exeter City Center and some of the Roman ruins. So it was pretty nice for me. And we weathered it quite well. They thought that we were going to get some storm surge in Tampa. They were predicting 8-foot surge. My house is 7 feet above sea level. So I was a little worried, but as it would happen, the water actually sucked right out of Tampa Bay, leaving some manatees stranded for a short time, and people venturing out, not worrying apparently that the storm surge would come back in to take pictures of them and help them. So in this study, we risk assessed a bunch of trees over the course of 2 to 4 years for different projects, giving them a 5-year time frame, which again, we don't really use anymore. But at the time, that was one of the options that was quite common in the BMPs. The research team revisited these things. There were 3 people after the storm. And we had used the USDA Forest Service risk assessment method for this study simply because track was so new. I wanted to use something a little bit more established. And also, I kind of like the rating. I don't have any favorite when it comes to risk rating systems. They all have their pluses and minuses. So I just wanted to try something a little bit different. And then we also did a really big study for this. We did 3,000 trees, although my most current study now has 11,000 trees. So we keep upping the numbers because the more data, the better we can get with our assessments here. This storm was a little bit more intense. We're up to category 1 as a hurricane. We're not a tropical storm like the last one. But it's still kind of what I would say the Goldilocks zone. I think tropical storms and category 1s, probably because that's what would hit us, it's my own bias, are good storms for this kind of research, where it wasn't too intense, but it was intense enough to cause meaningful failures in some sort of wind event that would be something that arborists could deal with and make judgments on. And I think Siegfried Fink wrote something similar in some earlier works when he was talking about VTA. So looking at this storm again, whole tree failures or major failures where a bunch of the crown warranted removal were relatively rare. Branch failures were more abundant than the last one, but still the vast majority of trees weathered this thing pretty unscathed, right? So we probably don't need to be as afraid of trees as most of us are, and the public generally even more so. If you're not familiar with this system, it's really kind of rigid, which is kind of nice for working with students and working with new people, because it's not a whole lot of thought that goes into it. I mean, there is, but it's like, how much, if something has a girdling root going over 40% of the circumference of the tree, it gets tossed into the moderate category, right? So there's really not a lot of interpretation that goes into that aside from measurement error, and the highest level, is even, the highest level for likelihood of failure talks about things like the shell thickness of the wood, and gives you a bunch of different criteria for rating risk. So it's easy to be really kind of in sync with each other, to be replicable, more so than the track method, I would say. Yeah, and extremely high is the highest level that they have. This is talking about, dead branches in the tree, hangers, dead standing trees, defects that are bigger than 40% of the circumference of the trunk, things like that. So if we look at these ratings in the same method that we looked before, I'm going to skip ahead. Again, we still have that same pattern where the low risk trees are the most abundant. And then as you go up a level of risk, there's fewer and fewer trees in that category. So, the high risk trees are relatively rare in environments, and we have Now, we still have significant differences in each of the categories, showing that there's enough categories and there's not too many for the system. But when you look at our extremely high rating, only 54% of the trees that have extremely high ratings failed, which is showing that this tree is grabbing defects and tossing them in as like a really high risk thing when they probably aren't when it comes to tree failure. So conclusions: branch failures are by far the most common thing, more so than whole tree failures, which when people focus so much on the little bit of the conch at the base of a tree, or things that are happening below ground, when the dead branch in the crown is probably the most likely thing to fail in a windstorm, right? And if your target's a pedestrian, then that's the thing you should be worrying about, not so much the bigger things, if you don't have evidence saying that they're really extreme. There is a definite separation between the rating levels for both methods assessed, which is good because it shows you that these ratings, there's assessment criteria for ratings, especially with matrices, and it's showing that there's good separation among the levels, which is what we need to see. And then that both methods were relatively accurate in my mindset, and the track method appealed to be more accurate. But again, this is like, at this point, this is just comparing two different studies. Yeah, there's a lot of trees, but we have an N equal to 2, only 2 data points when it comes to comparing systems. So it's essentially a case study, something I wouldn't want to hang my hat on, honestly. We want to get more studies. We want to get more information before we start making any sweeping claims about what system is better than others. So, yeah. And with that, I want to just thank my crew, Drew and all those folks that helped me with the research, thank the Forest Service for their funding on some of this work, and then Bartlett Trees for partnering with us and just giving us access to all the data that they've collected as part of their normal operations. And actually going out there and taking the post-storm data at a loss to make this work happen. So, and I will stop sharing with this. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. Absolutely brilliant. Jeremy, there he is. Brilliant. Thank you all very much. We've got loads of questions. I will say in advance, we can probably go on another half an hour or so. There's more than 500 people still watching, so you can probably go on for longer. But I'm not going to be able to get through all your questions. Please don't get upset if I dismiss or delete them as I go through, because I've got to try and keep some kind of order here. All the questions will be sent to our presenters, so you'll be able to see them. They'll be able to see them afterwards. They may choose to get in touch with you. One thing I'd just like to address quickly is there's been a few people in the chat, slightly ironically, using the chat to say that they think the chat is a bit too active and a bit too distracting. I apologize for that. That's not really been an issue before. Maybe it's because we've got so many people watching. What I would say, there's been a couple of calls to switch off the chat. Part of what we're doing here is trying to educate and inform people with these amazing speakers. But part of what we're trying to do as well is bring together people from all over the place to talk and share ideas and experiences and knowledge. So I'm afraid I side with the people who say the chat is a really good thing. So if it really disturbs you, you really hate it, this is going to sound terrible, but pre-recorded webinars, watching them afterwards, that would stop the chat coming up. So sorry if it's upset anybody, but we think it's a valuable part. So keep the questions coming in, even though we've got plenty. Jeremy, I'm going to direct most of these questions to both of you, I think, because I'm sure Andrew's got some thoughts on topping, and I certainly know that Jeremy's got some thoughts on risk management. A few people, David Winlow, Jess Denny, Tori Young, several other people as well, have been saying that they think maybe we need to change the definitions of topping. Some of the trees you showed as top trees, people don't think necessarily is topping. And Jess has said, for example, do you think we need to alter the definition of topping in the herb industry? Because many of these trees shown are not what I would call stereotypically topped.
Yeah, I think we definitely do need to change the definitions. And I think one of the big sort of downsides, as I said at the start of my talk, from all the good work that Alex did, is that he was so good and so effective at sort of condemning, I suppose, topping unnecessarily. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but it shouldn't be removed from the toolbox. There's very certain times when it could be a very useful technique. So I think what's happened is that there's been understandable confusion between where does topping start and where does subtler crown reduction, where's the boundary between them? And once you have a difficult boundary to define, then it's then very difficult for people to make a choice. So I think it needs clarification. I don't want anybody, it's a short amount of time to really deal with a big topic. And I don't want people to think that I'm advocating they should go out and top trees, as a matter of course. If you're an ecologist, that might be something that you'd go for, because the ecological benefits are significant from topping trees, but that's not the bigger picture. That's just one little view. But I would say that I think it shouldn't be removed from the arborist toolbox. And unfortunately, because the stigma that's associated with topping has been sort of transferred almost to crown reduction, we've got lots of circumstances and people very genuinely not wanting to be branded or stigmatized for doing something that's unprofessional. But actually, crown reduction is something that happens, like crown reduction happens in almost every botanic garden I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot. And you can see it's happening all the time. Now, they may not say they're doing it, but they are doing it. So it is happening, and we shouldn't be just pretending that it doesn't happen. So I think the terminology needs to be reviewed. I think that I'm not a scientist, so I'm just looking at what I see, but I know that there's some value from what I've seen in having all of these options available to you. And I think that's what I'm saying. So I agree with the question, yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Andrew, have you got any thoughts on that? Do we need to change the terminology involved in arboriculture when it comes to topping and crown reductions?
I would say that in the US, my perspective is that topping is the indiscriminate, or like internodal cutting, right? Where reductions can just be reducing the size of a natural pruning system like reduction cut, So there is kind of a disconnect in the terminology, I think, between the two countries. Because we would think of topping as just like rounding over at a certain height, whereas a reduction would be more of going back to a lateral that can take over,
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but one question, Jeremy, that's come in from a couple of people again is essentially, when does topping become pollarding? Philip's asked that question, and other people have alluded to it in the chat.
Yeah.
What's the difference between pollarding and topping?
Well, there's lots of technical differences. I suppose you do it on a regular basis. You start when the tree's young for pollarding, and topping, you'd think of topping as being where you take really large sections out of the tree. I think that the definitions need to be tidied up. I think that the difficulty that we have all the way through is that decision-making is based on, decision-making is very difficult to do by a recipe. So to have a certain size or frequency or whatever, and beyond that becomes topping, and beneath it becomes pollarding, is really not a very effective way to manage trees. And so what we should be looking at is, how does enduring decision making happen? What makes a decision good? What makes it last for a long time? What makes people align with it? And that is a combination. There's two things that affect it. One is experience. So how much experience you've got, and that affects the decisions that you make because of the things that you see. And the second is how intelligent you are. And that is about intelligent analysis of what you've seen, the information that you've got. Now, you can be the most intelligent guy in town, but only be 23 years old, and you're not going to get a reliable or enduring decision, or it's highly unlikely that you're going to get one. Alternatively, you can be the most experienced person in the world, or a very experienced person with 30, 40 years. I've been doing this for 50 years. Don't tell me what to do, Sonny. And they're a bit dim, and they haven't worked it out, and they haven't thought about it. So you can get those extremes. So we need to be moving away from this idea of a recipe to get to an answer. We need to be looking at finding out as much as you can. That may be a lot or not a lot. And then intelligently looking at how you come to a conclusion, and then be able to explain that. And I think that's what's been missing from arboriculture, and missing from lots of other professions as well. And I think that's where we've got to get back to.
Thanks, Jeremy. Right, let's change direction slightly. Question for you, Andrew, from Charles, who I believe is in the Philippines. Hi, Charles. Thanks for joining us. How about planting climate resilient species in order to minimize risk? To what extent can we minimize risk through species selection?
That's kind of a thing that we've been working on here in Florida, and so like folks like Mary Derrier before me have looked at storms afterwards and really kind of got some really nice species profiles going for what's resilient to our typical storms and which ones aren't. That's good, you know, and that's important for like areas where you have targets and maybe high use corridors or evacuation routes or routes that take you to the hospital, right? My one concern is that if you only limit yourself to the things that are bomb-proof, resilient trees when it comes to wind, you lose genetic diversity, right? I mean, in Florida, we're already in that tension zone where we are too hot for most temperate species and we're too cold in the central part for the tropical species. So adding another layer of filtering just puts us in a situation where we have 20 or less key species dominating our urban environments. So with everything, you know, if you want to engineer things to the fullest, you set yourself up for some losses when it comes to maybe the next invasive species or the next disease that comes through, you know. And if you have a wealth of options, which we don't actually have in Central Florida, by means, go for it, you know. But for other people, just kind of be judicious in how you do it.
Jeremy, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, quite a lot. I'll try and keep it quick. I'll try and keep it short. I think the principle is what I'm concerned about. Henrik Schoeman from Sweden has done one of the best, and there's US researchers as well that have done the same thing, has come up with really one of the most intuitive and best approaches to selecting species that are suitable for the location. Now, it doesn't matter if it's planting or for storm resilience or whatever you want. His work is basically down to planting species selection for the location, for the conditions. And that is the sensible way to do it. We're doing it back to front from a planting point of view in Britain and in most of the countries, where what we've got is really grubby old streets and really a poor rooting environment. And we're trying to put trees in that can't cope with that and then adjust the rooting environment, which costs a fortune. So why don't you step back and do the sensible thing? If you were planning it, what you do is say, well, these conditions are dry, hot, you know, no watering, it's windy or whatever. Let's go around the world, find identical type, very similar types of environments, take the genotypes that have evolved there, so the provenance of a particular species, that's evolved at between 170 and 200 meters in elevation and on the west facing side of a mountain or something. Find the ones that have survived because they've been genetically selected over, you know, millions of years to be the best survivors in that situation and put them in the streets. Now that's about planting. That makes sense. It would be done if it wasn't for the fact that we've got nurseries trying to sell products here, which are the things that grow fastest rather than what's best for the streets. You can have exactly the same principle with selecting for storm resilience, if that's what you wanted. You go or find, it might not be possible, but you try and find a location where they get hit regularly and there hasn't been intervention by man. And so you find, and a storm can be wind, it can be snow. So you find Picea morica, which is Serbian spruce, which grows, and other species of spruce as well, which grow where there's heavy snow all the time. And what do you find? You find very tall, thin, narrow trees. The branches get loaded with snow, flop down, and then flop back up again. Now that is an adaptation to survive a particular set of conditions. So if you have heavy snowfall, you go for those types of trees. I don't actually know the answer relating to trees that can withstand wind damage, but I think the principle is absolutely sound, and I'd advocate that.
Thank you, Jeremy. The chat's still raging. Sorry to those of you who don't like it, but Jackie's just said no trees grow naturally in streets. Doesn't matter where you look in the world. I think that's quite fair, really.
Well, that I'm afraid I disagree with because all you have to do is look at London Plain and the adverse conditions when you start digging around in streets that these trees have to cope with. They'll grow in anything. And, you know, you're looking at trees growing on the side of mountains with hardly any soil in the most adverse conditions, and they're still surviving. So they can do it. You've just got to change it. Not you. One has to change their mindset to try and take a slightly different approach. It's too easy to get locked into this is the way it always was. We've got to try and adjust things to our own circumstances. Let's start taking a different approach. So you step back and you have a rethink about it. That's really hard because you have to think intelligently.
Absolutely. And we won't carry on with this, but Mike Sankus has just made a good point in the chat as well, all about provenance as well. Mike says he was taught it at Merris Wood in 1965. So it's all about provenance.
Provenance, John, is critical. I used to grow Christmas trees, and Christmas tree provenance is absolutely critical. And you can transfer knowledge from one discipline to another. And that's what we should be really focused on in urban arboriculture.
Okay, let's look downwards. I'll come to you first with this, Andrew, then on to Jeremy. There's been a good bit of chatter, a bit of healthy discussion about soil. And this conversation was started, as so many good conversations are, by Neville Fay. Neville said, why is there no discussion of roots and soil? We're looking at the tree from the neck up. Management needs to look at the roots and the soil. We're standing on these trees, the roots, the soil, the whole ecosystem. We're not touching on the fundamental aspect of what the tree is. Why deal with crowns when we can nurture the soil, which is the tree? We need a new paradigm. And then on from there, Mark said, I think in one of the questions or the chat, that the root zone is important, and is vertical mulching worthwhile in compacted sites? And then Navin as well said, what experience have we got with heavy reductions in conjunction with root zone decompaction? So there's a lot of words there I've just said, but it all comes down to the importance of the soil and the relationship of topping, pruning, or even risk management and soil. So Andrew, I guess, how important is the soil in this question?
Muted. Of course, it's very important, things like compaction and poor drainage and stuff, that they can lead to crown dieback, and that's usually the first sign that you have poor rooting conditions. I think there is a lot of focus of crowns in urban environments just because crowns can grow into things, or when they fall they can hit things. So whereas in a natural system you just don't have the targets present, we do have more of a fixation on the above ground part of the tree in an urban environment, given the fact that gravity is a thing, so yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Jeremy, you were nodding when I was talking about soil there. What are your thoughts?
I was nodding in appreciation of Neville coming up with a great answer. Neville's always about 3 years ahead of the rest of the pack. That's always the way it has been. And if I wanted to know what was coming next, I used to phone Neville up and say, can we have a chat, Nev? And I used to go and see him and find out what he was doing, because I can't think of all this stuff by myself, but he can. He's an original and lateral thinker, and his soil initiative is just outstanding. It's probably one of the best things which has ever happened or ever come out of arboriculture. So, a heads up to Neville on that. I think it's obvious if you've got a genetically deficient tree or problematic tree with lots of, predisposition to co-dominant unions or weak unions, then you've obviously got a problem. But if you've got a standard tree and you get it growing in the right conditions, it can cope with almost anything that's thrown at it, other than one of Andrew's hurricanes, which we don't thankfully have here very often. We had one in 1987 and one in 1990, but we haven't had any since. Yeah, so I think it absolutely is a starting point. It's my weak area. I think it's a lot of arborists' weak areas, and so you feel very reluctant to talk about it. But when you see the way soil is treated, I mean, this is from a planning point of view on development sites, and how it's heaped in and compacted down and left there for 4 years, scraped off the top, and they put it back in gardens and expect trees and plants to grow. These people don't know what they're doing.
Thanks, Jeremy. Fully agree, with a shout out to Neville Fay as well.
Oh, yeah.
Where am I looking? I did have this right in front of me. Right, there we go. Now, this question is to Jeremy, but then I'm going to come on to Andrew straight afterwards. It's a question from our friend Daniel in Israel. Hi, Daniel. Jeremy, could you please elaborate a little about the problems with the tomograph readings and old trees?
Okay. I mean, I'm not a tomograph expert. I think that we do risk assessment on and management of literally tens of thousands of trees, and the only bit of kit we've got is a hammer and a screwdriver, and that's what we take with us. And so you can do most of it without any of this fancy kit. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't have its place, and there are certainly instances where we would use it, but we wouldn't use it ourselves. We get in experts. So we get in people who are using it on a daily basis. And the problems that I've seen, and it's just as a personal experience, is I've probably seen more trees condemned by unnecessary, ineffective, incompetent use of this technology. And the big problem, and it may have been resolved, and in fairness, I'm not an expert on this, so that's why we go to somebody else, but is effectively you get, if you get cracks or splits or shakes, and they can be ring shakes in trees like sweet chestnut, castanea, or they can be star shakes in trees like oak or cedars particularly, then it can affect the readings. It can make it look like the center of the tree's hollow. Not that that should be any reason to fell the tree anyway, but I can tell you that that is what happens most of the time. And to use these things, first of all, with untrained or unsupervised or ineffective operators is just deadly. It's like any tool. You put a hammer in the wrong hands and it's going to cause a whole load of problems. You put one of these and it just causes so many problems. I'm not against using them. They should be backed up with another method to confirm what you think the results are. And also the big downside for them is that it's really hard. You get an image of the level that you do it at, which means you don't see what's going on beneath the ground. And the only way really, other than dig the thing up, and you may not want to do that, is to do something like a pulling test on it. So I would say, tomographs really in the hands of the users, can be dangerous if you've got the inappropriate people using it. I'd say the most effective way of finding out what's going on is a pulling test, and then some crown reduction to improve the risk rating.
In reality, of course, speaking as a former tree manager, pulling tests can be pretty costly and hard to organise. And Andrew, what thoughts have you got on tomographs, or whether it's pickers or resistograph or any other of that sort of method?
Yeah, I mean, we have a tomograph system, we have a resistograph system, we have drills, we have rubber hammers, mallets. So we use them all in our work. And I'd say that the tomography is mostly just a really good visualization tool for the layperson. Jeremy was specific. He was totally right. They can have false positives with cracks and ring shake, and you really want to use like a resistograph or a drill if you're really interested in decay detection. That's probably the more effective for getting past those limitations. There's a crack detector function in the algorithm for the Picus system to help you kind of see when that might be a problem. But who knows I don't know the effectiveness of that, but the visuals are just the selling point. You can really drive home, if you've confirmed it, what you're seeing in the tree. The real problem is we don't have the science isn't to the point where we know what to do with this. Even if you had like an amazingly accurate internal decay detection system, it's still just a guess at that point as to what to do with that information. So, we have rules of thumb and some models based on forest systems and things like that, and conifer systems. But what to do with a giant tree that looks more like an amoeba in cross section than a cylinder is anyone's guess, really.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to stick two questions together here, which are probably aimed at Andrew, but I'll go to Jeremy first, and then we'll go on to Andrew afterwards. Jeremy, Guy has said, what role should formulas play in assessment? Aren't they unreliable and misleading? I decided to bite with Guy's question. I've gone with it. But a sort of supplementary question from Ian. When you've got a severe wind event, don't visual tree assessment systems break down altogether? Because even healthy vegetation can fail in those hurricanes Andrew was talking about. So, Jeremy, you want to address those points?
I think just doing the last one, because that's the one I can remember. Just to ask me again. Sorry. Yeah, that's the trouble when you ask too much. My brain's struggling.
I'm sorry. That's entirely my fault. So the first one was, should we rely on formulas at all? Aren't they misleading?
Yeah, look, all formulas are, they have their place, absolutely, for sure. And if you're trying to identify the strength of a piece of wood or something like that, then for sure. But you know, formulas, you can't start applying a formulaic approach to managing tree risk and assessing trees. It doesn't work. You know it doesn't work. What we can have is we can have processes and approaches, but we know that there's no way to be consistent, or it's very difficult to be consistent between assessors, between trees, all of those sort of things. So what formulas do is they act as like a little crutch, or a big crutch really, for people that don't have experience. If you've got very little experience, you're in trouble if you're trying to assess tree risk, because what it means is that you are not going to be as reliable probably as someone that's got much more experience. So this all comes back to it's, you know, this idea that professionals or people that can deal with complexity is where the seat of a lot of arboriculture problems rest. And what we should be doing is stepping back and saying, what did we used to do before we had these fancy formulas and fancy ways of dealing with things? And what we used to do, because I was there and I was doing it, is you used to go to a tree, you used to stand in front of it and think, is it going to blow down, or is a branch going to fall off? And if you decide it's going to happen, so this is yes, no, not it's a 70% chance. What does 70% mean? It's utter nonsense to try and transpose these concepts that were designed for factories where statistical data was really good to a natural environment where the data is just total rubbish. So what good is that? What you're doing is you're standing in front of a tree, you're trying to decide if a bit's going to fall off or it's going to fall over. If it does, is it going to hit anyone? If it isn't, you don't have to do anything. If it's going to hit someone or something, then you have to then specify work. You're an arborist, you're the advisor. The duty holder is the person that decides whether they want to do the work or not. And then after that, then you go back and check the tree. So that's the system that requires, first of all, like I said to start with, and I can't emphasize this enough, first of all, you need experience. And secondly, you need a brain to be able to apply that experience. And if you don't have either of those, then you're in trouble.
Okay, so you need experience and or a brain. That yeah. I certainly feel woefully inadequate, but okay. Oh, someone started screen sharing. Oh, Andrew. How exciting. I hope that was deliberate. We're not going to see something horrendous. You're muted at the moment, I should warn you, Andrew. Andrew, you're muted at the moment. I'm not sure if you're trying to...
So I was looking for a figure which was in the other presentation I was working on this morning before I switched to this one at the last moment. But, you know, I think formulas, there's two different ways of looking at it. You know, like Matheny and Clark adding the risk, the target rating plus the likelihood of failure rating plus the consequences of failure rating. That's a formula. It's just a summation. It's something that my daughters can do, right? And they're smart too, but like not to downplay that. But you know, so that's a formula, and that's very simple. And I think from that regard, formulas are very useful because we did a study where we used some decision analysis methods to see if you just told an arborist to rate a tree's risk, you know, just from their gut level instincts, what's driving that rating. And 50% of that decision was made by the defect itself, right? And less than like 8% was actually the target, you know? So what a formula does is it forces you to do a systematic process. And you know, matrices are a formula, the QTRA wheels kind of a formula in a visual format. And you know, the valid is just that behind a fancy interface for an app. You know, they all have mathematics behind the scene that are kind of guiding you to get a summary or a final risk rating for 3 different types of information. You know, when it comes to like probabilistic models where we're doing forecasts like the weather or NOAA to see if a tree is going to fall based on some mathematical inputs, I don't think we'll ever get that for urban trees. I really just don't. Like, we don't have the data available. Trees are just too complex to model. And even like all the money that goes in the hurricane model, like the spaghetti plot goes like 20 different ways before it misses you, you know? So, you know, so I agree. But, you know, there's always gonna be a formula part to it. But at the end of it, there's always going to be some sort of qualitative input, even in methods that want to be quantified, that comes from the arborist. So.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll combine the other question I was going to ask in a slightly different way. So Michael has asked you, Andrew, what do you think of Klaus Matuk's VTA system of assessment? And I will bring in Ian's question there again, which is that when you have conditions like a hurricane, don't all visual tree inspection systems break down in the face of that kind of weather event?
Yeah, I mean, so if you talk to Norm Easy, who is the executive director for our chapter and like kind of the main track trainer, in his mind, everything's out the window when it's a hurricane. I would say that, you know, a low level, there's different shades of hurricane, right? If you have a category 4 and it's blowing the shingles off your roof and, you know, blowing the siding off your house, yeah, then there's no risk assessment that's meaningful at that point, right? But I think like a lower level hurricane or a tropical storm, those happen frequently enough in certain parts of the state, like in certain parts of the world, you know, every couple of years, where you could get a sense through experience of what to expect with those conditions. And you know, it's not like it's happening every 10 years. It's happening quite regularly for like the Panhandle, you know, and things like that. So VTA, you know, I have the books. I love mathematics work. You know, so I think it's useful. I don't think all of the things, you know, some of the rules of thumb, you know, I think they're helpful, but they may be able to be improved upon, you know, with more data. You know, like some of the things like the shell wall thickness, you know. But I think you know, it's a precursor to a lot of the methods that we use today, you know, and there's so many methods out there, and some purport to be better than others, and they might be better, but are they useful? I mean, a lot of them are useful, even if one's mildly better than the rest, you know? And I don't get too caught up into like different versions of risk assessment, because every one that I've kind of tested has had its use and been relatively helpful. So.
Thanks, Andrew. Jeremy, unless you've got anything particular on that, I've got another question to come at you with.
Let me just quickly, first of all, I agree all bets are off outside of storm conditions, you know, inside storm conditions, really bad, severe storms. So that's the first thing. VTA, what Klaus did was fantastic, because what he did was put into a written format what we'd all been doing for 15 or 20 years anyway. And I think VTA, whatever you want to call it, Klaus didn't invent it, he just codified it, is what we've been doing all the time. And what we should be doing is going back to the basics. That doesn't mean that we should throw away the tomographs and the various methods, because they all have their uses. But what they should be is just one tool or tools in the toolbox that we can use to help us make a decision. That's what they should be doing. None of them are any better than each other, and they're all flawed. But you know, in the end, it comes down to experience and judgment, and that's what, unfortunately, we have to get back to.
And if I could add, you know, I think like with our research and just general common sense, you know, we're really good at knowing what's going to fall. Like the things that are like definitely going to fail, we're pretty good at that. The things that are definitely safe, you know, we're good at that too. You know, it's the middle ground. It's when we get to the gray area where things get a little dicey. And if we can just wait a little bit and just take our time and not react, a little bit of time will show you if it's heading in a positive trajectory or a negative one, you know? So we have these knee-jerk reactions to just kind of just do something right now, be the expert at the moment. But if we have the luxury of just waiting a little bit, that can be really helpful. So, and it'll tell you which way we're pulling towards the definitely bad and the definitely good, you know?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm aware that I should really be finishing this up now, but we've got about 400 people still watching. So unless you've all got terribly tragic lives, I think we should just push on for just a little bit more. I know we've all got things to do, but there's so many questions I want to ask them. Jeremy, I think I know what the answer to this is going to be, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. A question from Bettina. I'm curious to know how slowly or quickly the cross-sectional area of the topping cut decays away. have you been able to get back to some trees with very large topping cuts to see? I think that's really interesting, because a lot of the time as arborists, we're told, don't make these big cuts because of the inevitable damage and decay that will follow. But have you been able to see that over the long term?
Well, what you see is sloping cuts because it makes the water go off. You see capping around them because it keeps the water off and all those sorts of things. I think that's just misinformed. I think it depends on species. Absolutely, it depends on the individual within the species, because you can get some oak that fall apart immediately and others that will last forever. So it's huge variation. So it's about genetic variation, about species. Look, you wouldn't want to do it from the idealistic point of view. We have to accept that it's going to cause harm to the tree or compromise the tree to some extent in most circumstances. It may allow it to live longer, but what we also have to do is just forget we're not just, we may be interested in trees, but other people are interested in loads of other things like ecology and topping. So making big cuts is fantastic for ecological benefit and diversity. In fact, if that was our primary objective and we were ecologists, we'd be topping every tree we could, because that gives you the habitat and the diversity that you just don't get with a tree that's got no defects. So there needs to be a wider debate on this. We need to step back and stop, be a bit more open, have a broader perspective on things. The trees, that matters. We're tree specialists, but actually there's other things that are probably quite a lot more important, like really rubbish shaped trees that give people huge amounts of pleasure because they like looking at them because they're unusual, or the ecological benefits that come from having great big cavities and trees falling apart. So I think we can do better than what we're doing. And we need to start thinking a bit more intelligently and start getting out a bit more, rather than sitting in our offices and just thinking we know what's going on.
Interesting, Jeremy. And Andrew, I can come to you if you've got any thoughts on this in a minute. But Jeremy, you were talking about ecology and how these reductions would be good for ecology. Carl has made an interesting point about the obvious reduction in biodiversity caused through the reduction and loss of foraging area for bats, and that bat habitat and foraging areas should be considered as well. So how do we balance the differing needs of different kinds of species in biodiversity?
I think that's exactly right, because bats need the foliage, they need the lines of trees and all those sorts of things as well. But bats are just one part of the equation, and the other parts are small mammals, invertebrates, the fungi, which are breaking down and feeding and sustaining the ecosystem. And that's the same whether we're in the middle of the town, in urban areas, or in the middle of the countryside. So I think I'm not saying I don't know the answer. I'm not an ecologist, but what I do see is I'm sorry for our overseas visitors, but tree creepers are wonderful little birds, woodpeckers, and all of the life that goes on with these slowly dying trees. The best tree from an ecological point of view is one that's slowly dying. That is on its last legs, but you can keep it there for 50 years. That's what we're trying to do. Keep the things alive, but just alive, so that you've got that slow process. And that's where habitat diversity comes in.
Thanks, Jeremy. Andrew, have you got any thoughts on the habitat biodiversity and reduction debate?
Not especially. I mean, honestly, Americans usually want less habitat because that means a critter, a snake or something. So we're not at that level yet. There are some more progressive parts of this country, like Pacific Northwest, where they're really starting to think about that. But there's not a big debate going on here, unfortunately. So. Well,
can I just end? Or we're getting close to the end, but we need a decent story here. On snakes, because Andrew reminded me. I was in Mumbai, right? I was in Mumbai last year, and we went to this development site, and there was this tree, and a really nice tree with loads of sort of ivy creeper on it. And I said to my host Vibab, I said, well, where's the fencing? There's no fencing around here, right? And he said, oh, we don't need any fencing. That's where the cobra lives. It was just fantastic. Anyway, it probably wasn't a cobra, but that was the gist. I'm so sorry.
So all you UK Arbs, no cobras, no hurricanes. You've got it really easy. I'm going to keep working through a few more questions. If we could try and keep the answers quite short, gents, just because there's so much out there we want to talk about. Oh, this was actually for Jeremy, but I'm going to go to Andrew first. What do you think about a question from Mark? What do you think about Ed Gilmore's work? Possibly Ed Gilman, I think, but Ed's work at the University of Florida about crown reduction and hurricane resistance.
Yeah, I mean, Ed had a turboprop engine from, I think it was like 4 engines from like private jets just blasting trees, you know? And it was pretty interesting. I think most of his work was with smaller trees, you know, things that you could put in, you know, maybe 2 stories tall. So it did show that there was significantly less sway and bending in the reductions. So that is definitely something that he prescribes to. I know that he had some trees that were weakened after Hurricane Matthew, and he had, you know, his own property that were mature, and he had them all reduced to make up for the strength loss of the root systems. So.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think probably the stuff I saw was really small trees. I mean, it's great stuff. Ed Gilman is really good. He's one of these very unusual scientists, I suppose, that can communicate very well as well. So he's fantastic. I was thinking, when you said Gilmore, I was thinking, oh, Pink Floyd, but anyway, not quite. What I think, what was I going to say? This issue, I couldn't talk much about dynamic mass damping, and you know, because it's complicated and it's late at night and it's difficult for people to get the grips with, really. It's certainly for me. But you know, there's a difference between the way branches behave on a young tree where they flap around, which is what I've got David Gilmour now, which Ed did with his wind machines, which was pretty spectacular. But you know what Ken James has been working on and is starting to think about now, or he's probably published, I've spoken to him for quite a long time now, but is that the static mass makes a difference. The stuff that's sitting there that's not moving, and big trees behave differently to small trees. And I think we haven't understood that properly. And I think that's probably a big part of the resistance that there is to crown reduction, because there is a fear that you lose mass damping, that you leave your trees more vulnerable to failure. But, you know, I don't understand why, but it can't be the case, because I have seen it done to literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of trees. And, you know, the results, I mean, the results from the poll was 74% of people said no, they hadn't seen reduced branches fail. That means something. That's a body of knowledge which is most unusual to have access to. And I think everybody's got to start listening to that.
Thanks, Jeremy. Absolutely agree. Okay, I want to ask them all, and I don't think I can. It's too bad. Okay, let's do a quick one. Jeremy, question from Paul: does crown reduction reduce sudden branch drop?
Well, I could do a whole seminar on.
You could, but don't.
Yeah, it's not a branch drop, all right? Let's put it like this: is that for example, I'm not sure if Q had a policy of reducing the risk. It was a written policy, so it's there for people to see, of reducing the risk from storm damage and summer branch drop, whatever you want to call it. And that policy included crown reduction, so branch reduction. Now, if that isn't a valid way of trying to reduce the risk of storm damage or summer branch drop, if you lump them together, then you know you form your own view. My view is that is an effective way to manage it. You don't want to. It's much more complicated than that very simple answer, and I can elaborate on it if we had more time, and I'd be quite happy to, because I could talk to you for hours on summer branch drop alone.
Thanks, Jeremy. Andrew, summer branch drop, is that something you deal with much in the States? It's always summer in Florida, surely.
Yeah. No, honestly, it doesn't happen commonly here. I was in New Zealand in Christchurch, same tree that Jeremy showed, and it's amazing how many branches are dropping in that botanical garden after the earthquake. But yeah, it's not something that happens enough here where we could even study it, you know.
It's always interesting how so many different regions have completely different problems, not just cobras, but also summer branch drop. One question I want to touch on, I go to Jeremy first, then Andrew, then I'll do my favorite last question, and then I think we're all going to have to go home, despite the fact there's more than 300 people still watching, which is just great. So a question about thinning. Jeremy, I'll come to you first. Question from Trevor. Historic thinning seems to be a bigger problem than reduction, as it removes possibilities of reducing the canopy to internal live growth.
Yeah.
As thinning was more recommended from my college days, should we be talking about the negative impacts of thinning more?
Absolutely. If you're looking at ancient trees, so, trees that progress through, what we get is it's dead easy, right? Thinning is a doddle to do. You stick your rope at the top of the tree, you climb around, it's easy to do. You don't have to go out on the ends of the branches. Any idiot can do it. And that's why it's been done quite a lot. And what you do is, by cleaning out the inner crown and making it look really nice, because it does look nice, is that you remove all the potential for many species of trees that don't have dormant buds. You remove the potential to then reduce them back down when they start to get problems. And so what you're doing is condemning the tree to a much shorter life than it would do. So I agree. There's lots. I mean, I can't deal with everything in this space of time, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. So yeah, I'd agree with that entirely.
Andrew, do you think that thinning is something we're not considering enough as a problem in arboriculture?
I mean, the thinning that was just described by Jeremy is what we would call lion's tailing here, Yeah, and definitely, I mean, it's gone from, I mean, I still see it all the time because, again, it's easy, like Jeremy said, but it's come as far as topping, as far as being a bad word in the States, whereas thinning just to get more light penetration to the ground for turf is somehow okay, which is what our definition would be, unless Guy's going to correct me in the comments. So, definitely when it comes to the mass dampening point of view, I mean, you're reducing all those interior branches that, will lead to the mass dampening, which will keep the branch from swaying too far out of line and fracturing, whereas just reducing a little bit of weight at the ends can lift up a branch, can do a lot of work, good work. And then to the point that we were talking about before, there's at least a little bit of evidence in the smaller trees that reductions can lead to less wind resistance, which is one of the reasons that people were doing lion's tailing in the first place, was to make them more resistant to windstorms when it seems to be contrary to the fact. So.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Okay, look, I think that's the end of the questions that we'll ask from everybody. There's loads. We haven't got through them all. So they will be sent on to the panelists, as I've said, and they can answer. I do want to ask my question. I'm going to exploit my position, as always, to ask my question, which is, what's your favorite tree book? And I'm going to ask Jeremy first, because it looks like he's forgotten. What's your favorite book to do with trees, Jeremy?
No, it's not good. It can't be. I can't give you a favorite tree book, but I can give you a favorite book. And actually, this does have something to do with trees. It's Shogun by James Saville, and it's about Japan in the 1600s. And Japan has some fantastic trees that I really, heritage trees. One of my other passions is heritage trees. The trees, I'd just love to go over there. But I won't ever go there until the Japanese government stop whaling, along with Iceland and with Norway.
Thank you, Jeremy. Andrew, book recommendation.
It's not a favorite book, but it's a favorite book for now. So the one I'm really into photography, and trees are a tricky subject. So I've been kind of going through this book right here, which is from Kew Gardens, which is Photographing Trees. Very intuitive title here, and it just has some great, inspirational shots for folks that are into photography with your iPhone, with your DSLR, or whatever it is. So if anyone's interested in it, or even for your own consulting work, if you want to capture something a little bit better, image quality to really highlight what you're trying to show, it's a good read.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And as always, the book recommendations of our speakers will be, we'll put a link out probably underneath the talk when it goes on YouTube. Some people asking if they can watch it again. Yes, you can, is the answer. And just keep an eye on our website. That, I think, is the end of that. I can't believe I'm wrapping up a webinar when we've got more than 300 people still watching. But hey, what can you do? That was brilliant. Gentlemen, thank you so much, Jeremy and Andrew. Really, really outstanding. So thought-provoking.
John, can I just say, thanks so much for everybody attending. It's just fantastic. I just feel very proud, and to have so many people from all over the world is just great. And I'm sorry if I perhaps didn't make some of my answers clear enough, but I hope that most of it got through.
No, it absolutely did, and the chat's been amazing, and everybody seems to have enjoyed themselves. So it's great. So thank you to all of you watching. It really is appreciated, and please sign up for next week, because next week will be really good as well. Rachel Sheridan, Paul Mandabondabo, and we're going to have a look at global perspectives on urban forestry. So please hurry off and register right now. And I think that's it, really. I do feel at a loose end saying goodbye to this many people, because it's not like me to turn down a captive audience. But after 2.25 hours, I think we have to. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everybody watching. Thank you, Sophie, for doing all the hard work. Thank you, Sarah, for quickly extending our Zoom license. And hopefully we will see you all again next week. Take care of yourselves. Good night. Bye-bye.